Now let's look for a moment in the time that we have at the cross. Now listen. I was teaching several years ago in a seminary in Eastern Europe. It was all Germanic, and I was very tired, and I'd been teaching all day, so I went into the library, and I was looking there for a book to read. And I came across a book. It said The Cross of Christ. Now, it wasn't John Stott's book. It was another one. It said The Cross of Christ. So I pulled it off, and I began to read it. And I found the place. And this is what the author said. God looked down from heaven at the suffering that was inflicted upon His Son by the hands of the Romans on that cross. And He counted that as payment for our sin. That's heresy. Did you catch it? That's heresy. You say, what do you mean it's heresy? My dear friend, if you are saved here tonight, you are not saved merely because the Romans beat Jesus. You are not saved merely because they nailed Him to a tree. If you are saved because when He was nailed to that tree, He bore your sin, and God the Father crushed His only begotten Son. It was God who had to measure out the punishment. It is God who had been offended. It was God's wrath that had been kindled. It is God's justice that had to be poured out. Someone to save a people for God had to interpose and suffer the judgment, the wrath, the justice of God. Have you never read in Isaiah chapter 53 verse 10, and it pleased the Lord to crush him. It fulfilled the will of Yahweh to crush His only begotten Son. Now let's just look at that for a moment. Jesus is on that tree. And on that tree He cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? I heard one preacher, I've heard it several times, preachers saying God could no longer look upon His Son because He couldn't bear to see His Son's affliction. That's not what Jesus taught. What did He teach? My God, why have you forsaken me? Why have you abandoned me? He's directing us back to Psalms 22, and I want you to go there just quickly with me. We won't get through our text, but at least we'll get some of it. Psalms 22, verse 1. My God, why have you forsaken me? Far from my deliverance are the words of my groaning. Oh, my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but have no rest. Here is the complaint of the Messiah while He's on that tree. Why have you forsaken me? And then He gives an argument in verse 4. In you our fathers trusted. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried out and were delivered. In you they trusted and were not disappointed. There has never been a time in the history of the covenant people of Israel that a righteous man called out to you and you did not deliver him. But I, your Son, the Messiah, I hang on this tree. I have done no wrong. Why have you forsaken me? And then He gives the answer. Verse 3, you are holy. Verse 6, but I am a worm. On the cross. Well, you know all those little tracts, don't you? God's holy and man's not. And there's this great division in between the two. Don't you see, in order to close that breach, someone had to die outside of the favorable presence of God. Someone had to bear sin. Someone had to become a curse. Someone had to be like that scapegoat. The leaders of Israel would come out and lay their hands upon that goat, symbolically transferring the sins of Israel to that goat. One goat would be slaughtered and another would be driven outside the gates of the city, left in the wilderness to wander and die. So Christ suffered outside the gates of the city, cut off from God, cut off from His favorable presence, and cut off from the people of God. In order for that gap we're always talking about to be brought back together, someone had to die, separated from God's favorable presence. And separated because He bore the sins of His people and became a curse. even before his own Father. Have you never read Galatians chapter 3? Cursed is every man who does not abide by all the things written in the book of the law so as to perform them. Every man who has broken even one law of God is under a curse. What does it mean to be under a curse? It's a very difficult thing. It's such a horrible idea. Let me put it to you this way. To be accursed means that before a holy God and a holy heaven, we would be so heinous in our sin, so vile, that the last thing we would hear when we took our first step into hell would be all of creation standing to its feet and applauding God because He's rid the earth of us. But then it goes on in Galatians 3:13 and it says, "But Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law." How? Becoming a curse for us, on our behalf. The filth, the guilt, the shame before a holy God. The sense of being cut off from His favorable presence, of dying without Him. Separation. And then, not just separation, but wrath. Justice had to be poured out. It had to be. Now, it will be poured out on some of you. I'm not a prophet. I have no insight into your heart. But it would be very vain and unwise to suppose that every human being listening to my voice, whether here or via the internet or whatever, is truly a child of God. Wrath will be poured out on some of you throughout an eternity in hell, because of the crimes you have committed and will continue to commit throughout all eternity. The raging of your heart against the sovereignty of a good God. But on that tree, the wrath of God, the justice of God, was poured out upon the head of His only begotten Son. As I have already quoted, it pleased the Lord to crush Him. You know, when Jesus is in the garden, and 3 times He prays, "Let this cup pass from me." I have heard preachers say, well, the cup was the cross, the cup was the nails, the cup was the Roman whip. Absolutely preposterous. Because if that were the case, then tell me, how is it that the captain of our salvation is not as brave as His own followers? Is it not true that after the ascension of Christ, countless thousands of Christians have died on crosses? Crucified, not only crucified upside down, covered in tar, and set on fire to light the streets of Rome. And yet many of them went to those crosses singing hymns full of joy. So you're going to tell me that the disciples of Jesus go to the cross singing hymns full of joy, but the captain of their salvation, the Messiah Himself, cowers in a garden and doesn't want to go? Do you honestly think that the Lord of glory feared a whip? What was in the cup? Throughout the Bible, it tells us what's in the cup. If I were to sum up all the prophets and put them all together, I could say something like this. God speaking, "Because of the iniquity and the rebellion of the nations, I will hand them the cup of my wrath, and I will force them to drink it, and they will drink it, and they will stagger, and they will die." Someone had to drink the cup of God's wrath to satisfy His justice. On that tree, Christ took the cup of wrath and drank it down. You've all heard the story of Abraham and Isaac. He goes up on that mountain to offer his only son. The old man draws back the knife, lays his hand on the brow of his boy and draws back the knife. And when the old man's will has given in to God's, he brings the knife down and God stops him. And you say, what a beautiful ending to the story. It's not the ending. It's the intermission. Years and years and years roll past. And then God's only Son is hanging on a tree. And God lays His hand on the brow of His only begotten Son and brings the knife down and slaughters Him.